Welcome, everyone. We're going to give it just a few more minutes as people are filtering in and we're getting set up here. Thank you. yourself introduced, give a little bit of background, how you got to where you are now type thing. A little bit of perspective for the audience. Cool. Awesome. Try not to trip here. Hi, everyone. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Happy March Madness. Go Marquette. If there's any other Marquetters. Yes. Woo. And almost happy spring. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to the WTA's annual cybersecurity panel. Each of our panelists are tasked with protecting both their company's information as well as consumer data. We are joined by Kevin Anderson, Cyber Defense Center Manager for Associated Bank, and Devin DeSilva, VP and Identity and Access Management Manager at Baird. And this panel will be led and moderated by Andy Jaw, Senior Security Technical Specialist at Microsoft. I'll let each of our panelists and Andy provide additional background, but thank you again for your attention and for attending today's session in person. We look forward to connecting with some of you after the event over some green beer and Reuben rolls, but right now, let's welcome our panelists with a round of applause.
Sure. Oh, can you guys hear me? Oh, this is great. So hi, everybody. My name is Devin DeSilva. I have been with Robert W. Baird for about 8.5 years. So as Lena said, I have been with Baird, and I have worked in identity and access management with them, in risk management, and then previously I actually worked in our IT department as a business analyst. So I've got varying perspectives here. That'll be a great addition to this panel, so thanks for letting me come today.
And I'm Kevin Anderson. I've worked for Associated Bank for about 7.5 years now. I manage their cyber defense center, so I oversee security monitoring, incident response, threat intelligence, red team, intrusion hunting, and also vulnerability management. My background really was in forensics. I've been with an energy company, an insurance company, so I've been to multiple regulatory companies in that regards. But I'm happy to be here, and thank you.
Hey, and I'm Andy Jaw. I'm a veteran. I spent 10 years in the military, 3 years as a law enforcement officer. Got into corporate IT. I've been at various different companies at internal IT, and then most recently I'm at Microsoft. So I talk to a lot of customers about cybersecurity, and I host a weekly podcast on cybersecurity as well. So we encourage you, we're going to go through a discussion today, talk to the panelists, but we also encourage any questions you might have. So if you do have a question, do we have a mic that we could pass around for people if they have questions? Okay. All right. So if you have questions, just raise your hand, stand up, and ask. I will try to call on you. So we're going to begin. We're talking about how companies protect data and their customers' data. We're going to begin with some basic things and then start, kind of walk you through where you might be in your cybersecurity journey. If there are more medium parts of your cybersecurity or more advanced programs that we're going to talk about. So first off, we're going to start with some basic things. I'd like to call out asset management as one of the basic things that companies should be doing. Not only assets as far as servers and endpoints, but also applications. Are you continuously making sure you know where your assets are, where your data is? Because if you don't, you may not be able to protect it. So, Devin, what do you think about asset management as far as protecting data goes?
Sure, absolutely. So from my perspective, when we talk about asset management, it starts with the actual physical part of it, right, that Andy was talking about, but then it also goes down to the very granular, what access do people have to certain pieces of data, and then how do you manage that? So really kind of doing a data classification activity, something like that, where you're overlooking certain pieces of critical data. So think PII, social security numbers, addresses, also firm critical data, and understanding who's got access to that and how you're continuing to monitor that throughout the life cycle of that associate.
Kevin?
Yeah. So on top of that, I think asset management is crucial in understanding what's on your network. And from the regards of even if there's a potential breach or you're looking up an alert, something happened, understanding what that host name translates to, who's the stakeholder, who owns it, really helps in the event of how fast you can respond to something. The other part is, when it comes to vulnerability management too, understanding what assets on your system, so that way you're able to, if it shows up in a discovery scan or something, that's something that belongs there. On top of it, tying it into what vulnerabilities feed back into the system. And right back to the incident response part, we're understanding who the stakeholder is, so you know how to get that vulnerability remediated as soon as you can. So in organizations that struggle with asset management, they struggle in order to alleviate vulnerabilities, they struggle to respond and clear things up in those aspects too.
And I think if I can just, go ahead. Yeah, absolutely.
Like appliances, so you're on your network and you don't own the hardware. So do you have advice for how to make sure that those don't have vulnerabilities, their firmware is up to date? Any advice for that?
So we often do due diligence, consistent due diligence to make sure that folks are staying up to date, especially for critical software upgrades and items like that. Where you're thinking about, maybe servers, for example, if we know that there is a vulnerability, ultimately we'll be reaching out to those vendors to say, hey, just making sure this is up to date. Is it the most current version? How often do you patch your servers? Things of that nature is what we typically practice.
Yeah, and when you do, your typical scan with your Vuln tool, whatever it may be, you'll find those appliances. It'll come back. Typically, you'll either see the MAC address or something of that aspect, so you can tie it back to what it was. On top of that, kind of like Devin said, finding about who owns it, what the vendor is. The other thing that we use, we do a lot too when we have appliances, is when CVEs come into us that are above and beyond, say, what you may find with your Vuln scanner, tying that into that appliance, and at that point, working with the owner of it to work with the company to get that resolved right away. Does that answer your question?
And I think so. What I was going to add on to what Kevin was saying is, one of the questions that's probably going through your mind is, all of this sounds great, but at what point in the conversation do we bring this up and actually allocate resources to do this work? And so if you think about when you set up your incident response plan, if you look at the foundation there, that's really when I would recommend bringing up that conversation, saying, how can we put together a successful incident response plan if we don't know what's on our servers, who's got access to that data, and things of that nature. So just something to think about, food for thought.
I know at my previous company too, we struggled with applications and SaaS apps, and oftentimes information security doesn't own the applications, but we set policies to ensure compliance with our company's information security policies. So any advice that you might have to figure out and track all the different applications that might creep up in your environment, and specifically like administrative access to those applications, especially if information security doesn't own that particular application?
Sure, I can go with that one, yeah. So typically the way that we look at it is more around policy and then actually applying that, right? So information security typically owns the policy, but then we've got a counterpart of our security team that will actually apply that policy and put technical rails around that. So an example of that would be, information security says there needs to be a separation of duties. How do you make sure that you properly set that up? Is there an application that you can use for tracking, auditing, things of that nature to make sure that that separation of duties actually stays intact?
And there's a multitude of tools out there too that can give you the ability to asset manage your applications too, just like with your servers. A lot of the vulnerability scanners that are the name brands out there, they'll give you both, and that is a way of inventorying. And it is an active way of inventorying, because when you have, say, discovery mode set up and you run a scan at night, somebody just put up a new system on your network. At that point, you now have that inventory and what you have, what applications there are, and then tying that back application into, what vulnerabilities are there also. And in some cases, if you have a ticketing system like a ServiceNow or a Surewell, something like that, you can also tie that back into stakeholders in that regards too.
So when it comes to SaaS applications, at my previous org, we set up as a policy with information security that you aren't able to go out and acquire an application without it being a SAML-enabled SSO application. So if it does not integrate with our identity provider, then you're not able to get it. And so just kind of pivoting to identity, what other things should companies think about when it comes to protecting identities, because identity is the new front for cybersecurity. Like, for example, privileged accounts and privileged identities. Like, what should companies be thinking about when it comes to protecting those?
Would you like to take this one away, Kevin? Oh, me? Okay, I'll take this one. So let's start with the basics, right? So privileged accounts. Know who has a privileged account and know how you want to define a privileged account, right? So privileged accounts are not just privileged accounts on your domain. So for example, local admin accounts or platform admin accounts. They can also be admins within a business unit system. So think about a trading system who administers those individuals to allow people within the business to have that access. So first get the definition down, make sure you understand across the board what those privileged users are and who they are. In addition to that, what capabilities do they have? And are there any separation of duties? And I know I keep saying this, but it's something that is very important and should kind of be in the back of your mind, right? So if you have somebody, we'll go back to a trading system, that has privileged access, they can assign users, and they have trading capabilities, that would kind of cause you to sit back and say, I'm not sure, we should look at this a little bit more. Why is that? What are they using it for? Start asking those questions. And so then after you do that, it's that consistent review of those individuals. How is that access getting removed? How do they get access to the system? So things to consider. When you are off network, trying to SSO into a system, are you using MFA for your admins? Because you want to have that extra bit of security when you're talking about privileged users. So just a couple of different things around kind of level setting, and you can do this at any organization just to kind of understand what your environment looks like, and then also take some steps to improve it along the way.
Because then also you have to look at when someone transitions from one role to the next, if they maintain that privilege to what they had then in their new one, you get that concoction of rights that really gives them, domain admin almost credentials so that they can do more than what they should be doing. Or if someone was to compromise their credentials, be able to use that to give themselves privilege escalation too.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because as I'm listening to you talk about this, Kevin, I'm thinking we're always talking about people, right? Who has admin rights as a person? What about your service accounts, right? Those are things that you need to consider too. Do you have enterprise admin service accounts? How often are you changing the passwords on those? What about to deploy code? How often are you changing the passwords on those? Who has access to those passwords? Things like that.
Yeah, and going a little in depth about the passwords themselves. If you ever were to hire a team to come in internal to pen test you, right? Getting that hash of that password is, you'll see them doing their hacker dance, because at that point they get that hash and they can move forward. So being able to protect the passwords you have in some form, whether it's using a product to work through that aspect or whatever it is, that's really crucial to understand how you hold that key too.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up service accounts, because a lot of companies will use user accounts within Active Directory, not the general managed service accounts, which is a service, which have passwords associated with them. And oftentimes you'll check the box to never expire those passwords. So I know general managed service accounts are a lot more difficult, but they're a lot more granular. And then if you're in the cloud, just like with AWS or Azure, whoever you're using for your cloud provider, you can use things like service principals, which are machine accounts, right? They're an identity, but they don't have a login associated with them. Or scoping group policy for these service accounts to not allow them to be logged on locally. That's another thing. So you can put all your service accounts within an OU, and then scope a GPO to say, never allow this account to be logged on as a person to this machine, right? So those are basic defenses. Did I see a question out there? No? Yes.
Yeah, I got a question. Well, I got a couple of questions actually, if you don't mind. Sure. The first one is, could we, in the spirit of St. Patrick's Day, could we pronounce it data instead of data, just for the day?
Only if you say it every time.
My real question though was like, as you're kind of, you were kind of creating a balance between your on-site resources and like your actual human resources that you have. Like, for example, you get a scan afterwards, and the scan might be good news or it might be bad news. But if it's bad news, how do you then balance that? Right, I'm going to throw my own resources into it, or I'm going to get a tool that's going to fix this. And then how do you remain agile through that as your own organization grows? As you start moving to the cloud. Now there's new security concern. We just did hardware last year. Like, now we're doing the cloud. Like, how's that balance going? How do you maintain that?
I would start with prioritization, right? So basically, when you get your results back, look at which ones are your criticals, your highs, your mediums, work through there and then from there, tie it into, quickest wins at that point too, right? Because there's some that you're going to be able to do a quick Windows update patch. Others are going to take potential configuration changes, research tied into that also. So if you prioritize, again, based on criticality, time it takes to work through it. And the other half is, and especially as you grow as an organization, have established SLAs to when they need to be accomplished. Having those kinds of helps push a little bit as you grow, to have other people help you to get those done. Because, as you get, depending on how your organization is set up, there's some organizations that are, unregulated. So your same guy running the scan is the also one pushing the patches, and it runs a lot smoother. When you get into the larger organizations where you can run the scan, then you have to set them up for a change, and they have to wait for the change approval, and then you have to wait for their window for, it gets longer. So at least having that kind of laid out ahead of time.
So is that like for yourself, like an industry thing where like you identify something like, hey, we're just going to have to kind of live with this for the next 6 months until we like fix it, or like, is it a temporary, like how does that work?
So I hate to say the famous words, it depends, right? But it does, because one thing we always look at is there an exploit in the wild? Is that exploit being used right now? I think later we talk a little bit geopolitical too. In the geopolitical scene right now, where are you in that target list, and should you push this? And the third part I would say is, where in your stack from, the internet's out here and your core systems are here, where does it lie in there? So that threat vector, where it lies, and how fast can that be exploited, impacted in that regard?
And I think I also heard in your question something around, how do I determine if a person should do this or if I should get a tool?
I imagine that resources just internationally are short at the moment. So it's not like you can just be like, oh, we'll just hire another engineer, because there aren't any. They're all in Texas.
Right, and it's not even just going to get one, it's how do you get the funding to do it, right? And so a lot of it is, starting with what Kevin said, you understand what your environment looks like, start to prioritize, see how much some of that takes. Is it super manual, or is there any automation that you could do already in-house that may be less expensive, not as much year-over-year overhead cost? If not, and you're continuously doing this, you can then go to your management and say, listen, we've spent the time on this, we've automated it as much as we can, but then this tool that you're gonna spend a little bit more would free up this FTE to do other things such as X, Y, and Z. And so that's how you can kind of meld that into the discussion of, we need to have another resource.
I talk to a lot of companies, and I see them struggling with the basics in patching, right? And so part of my job is to try to help companies move to a more modern way of thinking. As IT practitioners, I think traditionally we want control. We want to push out those patches. We want to patch the software, the operating systems. But I think in this day and age, in the SaaS model, in the cloud, you want to automate and let those things automatically update as much as possible. So at my previous org, we were still on WSUS and using SECM to push out patches. How many times, if you ask yourself, how many times have you had to actually hold back a patch due to an issue? I'm willing to bet that it's not many times. And if you're manually patching, say, Office, I mean, why, right? Like, applications like browsers. We were holding back browser updates, and then when you scan them with a vuln scanner, I mean, the number of millions of vulnerabilities that come out every month for like a Google Chrome, it's numerous. And so those vulnerabilities that you're looking at these reports, and the executives who look at these reports are like, why do you have 1.4 million vulnerabilities listed on here? It's because we're using a 6-month-old Google Chrome, right? And so if you have an application that breaks because of a browser update, you should be asking yourself and asking your leadership, are you willing to accept the number of remote code execution vulnerabilities and subject your company to that type of risk for this application, right? So let's talk about device management. This is a big topic because, obviously we just got done, well, not done, but we're going on still, and we got done working from home, and everyone has laptops these days, mobile devices that can connect to your corporate data, email. What do you suggest to companies as far as mobile device management goes?
Are we going the round robin every single time? They're going to start with me. So at some point, I'm going to pass to somebody in the audience and say, would one of you like to answer? So be careful. If you're wearing green, you're fair game. But no, so mobile device management, right? So there is the aspect of having trusted devices. That's one particular way to go about it. So it may not be a device that's actually given to you by your firm. It could be your own personal device, like a phone or something of that nature. How are you doing MFA to make sure that that person is authenticating properly and that they should have access to your network? So those are two things that I would personally consider if you want people to be able to have your BYOB, bring your own, or BYOD, bring your own device. Those are some items that you can think about.
When we start talking about, bring your own phone too, that's a whole myriad of other issues to consider with your device, because everybody's now putting on, I say everybody, but right, the trend is to put Teams on your phone now, or put BlackBerry if you're still using that on your phone, and containerizing that data properly on that phone. So with the aspect of that phone, right, gets compromised, they're not getting into that data. On the other half is insider threat, so they can't screenshot the data. So if you're going to move into the step of, mobile devices and that, with that, you really need to look at how are you going to protect your data from, I'm trying to see how to put this right. Say the individual stealing your customer's database, leaving for another company, and then having your customer list because they had their phone out, right, and they were simply screenshotting things. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tricky thing because you can control where the data goes. You can control, things like not being able to screenshot. But then you get in a pickle when it comes to being flexible with people, because what if somebody has a calendar appointment that has an address in their Outlook and they want to paste it into Maps? How do you find what's your recommendation for kind of trying to strike that balance for some of those communities?
Yeah.
Another thing too is like forwarding an email from Outlook to a personal email address. They can still do that. So how do you prevent that sort of thing?
Yeah, so one thing to kind of keep in the back of your mind is sometimes you can't protect from everything, right? So protect with policy, just by saying, hey, don't forward to your personal email. That's something that I know we've got in place. And if somebody does, we know about it. So there's also, in the background, that technology aspect of it as well. Certain things that you may want to consider if you're looking at, Maps address, maybe not the highest critical thing, right? So this again goes to the priority of the data that you want to protect. If somebody's trying to screenshot PII, big issue. But if they just want to go to an address, and the thought behind it is that they're doing it with positive intent, that typically would be okay. So you're looking at the 5 out of 10, right, that feels a little uncomfortable and could get you fined or in a lot of trouble, but not so much trying to allow somebody in enabling the business so that someone can get to where their meeting is or something like that.
And if the concern is them, again, forwarding email off to their personal address, part of your email protection system, you can add in certain DLP rules that trigger off of certain addresses, items, and important data factors that you have. I can even say there's been sometimes when we've had abuse of the system and we just block the user straight out from going to Gmail or Yahoo because we know they're going to excessively do it because they want to share their calendar appointment, with their home app. So, who knows, Alexa tells them, hey, you have an appointment, so they want to go to it. But yeah, I think different controls in some of your other tools that are protecting your laptops can extend past the border and help other devices that are sitting there, such as, phones, tablets, stuff, items like that.
I think there's also the other piece of, so for bringing your own device, if that is something that you're looking at doing, there's also a change management aspect of that as well. So it's not just, you can put Teams on the phone, hope everybody knows how to use Microsoft Authenticator, and they're on their way. So there's also that aspect of change management that you should be working with your business units on to say, hey, we would like to enable the business to have teams be able to communicate with their other teams on their device. How do we work with you to better roll that out? And what does that look like? Do we pilot? Do we roll it out completely and just not give them a choice and just tell them that everybody's going to get it right off the bat? Some business units may choose to go one way, some the other. So there's also the change management perspective to look at as well.
And I think, just to answer a little bit of your question, cybersecurity is always about balancing risk, right? And to your point, a lot of times MDM solutions will either allow you to copy all or none. It's hard to trigger off of certain rules like that. And so I've run into this exact situation that you're talking about, deploying MDM at a company, and you just explain to your leadership, look, we can either block them from copying from a managed application to a non-managed application, or we don't allow it. And if we don't allow it, then this is the risk. They'll copy PII or HIPAA protected information or financially protected information. And we can track that, but there's a risk, right? And if they don't want to accept that risk, then you block it all, and then you deal with the wrath. And most of the time I say, okay, talk to the CISO, right? He's the one that made the decision. So you just forward it up. It's not your fault. You just implemented the solution that somebody else made a decision for. Yeah, does that kind of answer your question? Yeah.
So basically, always tell them to go talk to your CISO. That's what I just heard. Did everyone else hear the same thing? I'm just making sure.
That's what we do is we advise, right? Like if you're not the CISO and making the decision as practitioners, we advise of the risk. There are other solutions too, like for example, you could encrypt I don't recommend this, but you could encrypt all email, right? And then you have to sign in with a corporate identity. That's a terrible, terrible user experience. Don't do that. But you could manually allow users to encrypt certain email if they contain sensitive information. And then if they forward it off to their personal email, then they won't be able to read that unless they sign in with a corporate identity. You can also encrypt at the file level. So if you attach a file, you can encrypt that file using whatever encryption tool you have. Microsoft has its own, like Microsoft Information Protection, which integrates, but you could use a third party as well. So those are other ways to protect that. And you can even have like different cloud application security brokers, like a CASB product, allow users to be productive and check email in a read-only fashion, but then not allow them to download any information or screenshot it or print it out. Right? So there's other tools out there that can do that to help allow them to be productive, allow them to have access to things, but also protect the data at the same time. And then when we talk about device management, I want to also emphasize it's not just mobile devices, because people have access to personal Windows computers, personal Macs. So you want to think about, the holistic view of all the devices in general. Before we move on, I do just want to mention, let's go back to privileged identities real quick. Alex Weinhardt, who's an identity VP, product manager at Microsoft, had an article, a blog post after the SolarWinds incident, and he talked about separating out your privileged accounts for on-prem and in the cloud. So a lot of organizations I see syncing their identities from on-prem to a cloud provider or cloud identity provider. And a lot of times, you'll have domain admins, then also be global administrators or organizational management administrators who have the keys to the kingdom in the cloud identity provider as well as on-prem. So when you compromise the one identity, you have access to both. So one of the things that I start to advise companies to do is to start separating out your cloud and on-prem, especially if you're still using like ADFS or an on-prem solution to have access, because if you compromise the most privileged accounts and they're synced to the cloud, you're going to have access to both.
Yeah, one thing that we also considered as well is, do you need domain admin accounts? Or can you have one domain admin account that you check in and check out? And there's logging around that, who's asking for it. That way you don't have, maybe 10 accounts or something like that that are syncing. So that's another approach as well.
Yeah, like a just-in-time.
Yes.
Yep. So just-in-time for on-prem and just-in-time in the cloud. And there's actually solutions out there that can provide what are called ephemeral accounts. So you request access for a level of privilege, and then the solution will provision that account on the fly, then deprovision it when it's done. So that technology exists out there as well. So you're not providing standing access to something when they don't need it 24/7. So these are all the basic things that we want companies to think about, right? So let's move on to some more advanced things. Like for identities, one of the things that I like to highlight is passwords. How often are you expiring or rotating passwords, or maybe you don't even need passwords anymore in a passwordless world? That's ideal. Kevin, why don't we start with you on passwords?
And I guess I'll start with the struggle of passwords, right? There's still a lot of legacy out there, both in regards to mainframe systems where, you may want to be pushing that 8+ character, even passphrase. So let's stop using passwords and start saying passphrases into there, but you're just restrained to some degree. So you may, in that turn to a just-in-time, system in order to help that way in that regards. The other solutions are items really we're just looking into at that point, but anybody in information security has kind of seen how fast they can crack the password, and especially depending on what form they're using to store it in that regard. So moving to the longer characters, even using just-in-time systems, I think that's really where your strengthening goes. If you don't really know the password, that's where it really helps compared to summer 1 or summer 2, right? We see a lot of that, and I can honestly say when we bring an internal or even our own red team, they have that default string, and when they start trying to crack, that's right where they go for, and within half hour, they've gotten this list of passwords. Once they have your list of passwords, they're going in through, technically your remote system, and they're able to get in and start hiding themselves amongst the population.
Yeah, I know coming from a highly regulated vertical, one of the things that we look at is what are our auditors asking about? The first question out of their mouths is, what standard are you following? And what is the universal standard that you're following, right? So something like the NIST framework. Look at that, see if it applies within your organization. Every single thing on the NIST framework may not, but maybe there's certain items that you can adjust. And it makes it a little bit more convincing if you're looking to get executive leadership backing for those types of things as well. So that is one thing to consider. Another one is from an education standpoint for your associates, don't use the same password that you're using at work, that you're using for your other financial institutions, that you're using for your social media accounts. Please don't. And so those are the types of things that are super easy to just let people know that they shouldn't do. And you can also determine, how often do you want to recycle those passwords, moving to passwordless. Is your company ready for it yet? Are your users and your associates ready for it yet? So those are the types of questions that, there's a bit of change management with that as well. Another buzzword, so if you're playing buzzword bingo, you can mark that one down. But those are just a couple of things to think of going from the very basic to a little bit more advanced.
And to the part about, repeating your password, there are repositories out there that you can go find of sites that have been breached, and you can get that exact your email address, your username, and your password's right there. So I've seen that used many times when we're looking for, how does somebody get a business email compromised? How do they get into the business? And a lot of times it's the repetitive passwords. And again, it's publicly available. You could do a Google search and come up with usernames and passwords from cracked sites to be able to start using them.
Question.
What does your policy dictate for password length and the amount that you recycle them at your financial institutions?
So we follow whatever is in the NIST framework.
What's that for password length, right?
Right now, I'd have to look it up
Does anybody know?
for you.
So
I think, you know what, actually, I think that they just recently went from longer passwords to shorter because it was, I'm seeing you shake your head, so I'm assuming that that's true. But I'm pretty sure they went from longer to shorter and just more complex.
Shorter, but then they also want to look for known compromised passwords in a database.
Okay. Thank you.
Characters or 14 or 18 or
Used to be
what are,
14.
what are they
Used to be 14,
recommending?
and now it's,
I don't
it was
know.
in a single digit. Thank you.
yeah, so Alex Weinhardt, who is he's an identity, guru. He wrote a blog called "All Your Passwords Belong to Us," which is an evergreen and awesome one. In there, this was, I think, in 2020, an 8-character password was going to be cracked using like it was like an $18,000 supercomputer, which not like super expensive for, some nation states. So we're not talking nation states, but just, your old regular script kiddie at home. That could be cracked in like 2 months. So you look at the risk of an 8-character password versus if a 9-character password, it goes to like 3 years or something like that to brute force, right? And then at 10 characters, it starts to be, 20 years or something higher than that.
And correct me if I'm wrong, it's pre-NTLM, but if you use a 7-character password, it broke it basically in half, and the rest was padded with, say, zeros, which really give them anybody trying to crack that password a huge advantage in order to find out what that password was.
And if you want to talk about the NIST framework, just to give you an example, at Microsoft, we went to no expiring passwords. So we don't expire any passwords unless there's an indication of compromise. So based on dark web intel and all of that, if our passwords show as something that's compromised, then we're forced to change it. But otherwise, I haven't changed my password ever.
Ever?
Ever. Okay. I've set my password and that's it. But we do of course use trusted devices. We use identity protection, MFA, all of that stuff. So I could write you my password. I don't know what my password is. I could write it here on the board and give you my credentials, and you wouldn't be able to do anything because you don't have my phone. You don't have another trusted device. You're not logging in using an IP address that's ever been seen before. So all of those signals go in. I could write my credentials up here for you to try to log into, and you wouldn't be able to have access to anything. And that's the other thing too. You were talking about copying data and setting policy. One of the exercises that's good to go through is just how important is your employee and what data they have access to. Like for me, I'm not a program manager. I don't have any information to secret hardware that's being developed, secret code, any products that are coming out that are not publicly known already. And so I'm just kind of a peon, right? And so Microsoft has designated me as low risk to the amount of information that I have. And so I can use a personal device that's enrolled in MDM. I'm an admin on my machines. That may change in the future. They're piloting right now non-admins, but for the most part, the folks who have access to just publicly available information are treated as admins and everything. But then, of course, if you are a domain admin, you have a SAW, you have a PAW, you have to be on corporate network, you have a very locked down device, so that's critical information, right? All right, so let's talk about zero trust.
We made it all this way, and now you want to bring up zero trust. Are you guys ready for all this?
Buzzword. All right, so zero trust, I know that gets tossed around a lot for, as a buzzword, as a concept, but I often talk to companies about zero trust and if they're really actually implementing and trying to make their way towards zero trust. Because I'll tell you right now, like, no company out there has total zero trust, right? One example that's common that I see that, at previous companies that I've been at have done this, and I'm sure some of you are gonna nod in agreement, is you have an identity provider, you have MFA implemented, you're like, great, this is awesome. But then you exempt your corporate IPs from MFA because you wanna make it easier for your users. Well, now you've already taken out one component of zero trust because if your attacker has access to your network, and now they can circumvent MFA because you've given them that exception, right? So as a concept, what else do you guys think companies should be thinking about when they're moving towards MFA and what exceptions they're providing?
I don't like you just start with exceptions. No. Going from there. I think you really need to look at it, again, knowing where your critical data is stored, knowing what servers host those, consider them as critical servers, still mandating that you need to use MFA or a just-in-time in order to lock those down. So in case somebody does get in, that lateral movement can happen, or the privilege escalation on top of it. So I think it's really crucial to keep making sure. We always hear about your defenses have that hard exterior, but the soft middle, and that's really a part of it. Because once a phishing email comes in, they're in your network, right? Once they have that they start putting that foothold down, then they're now looking to make a back door and escalate their privileges in that attempt. Now having that point where zero trust is no longer there really just amplifies it, and really nothing's a factor at that point. They can do what they want.
Yeah, and I think in addition to knowing what's in your environment, it's also operating under the least privilege mindset. So because Sally's coming in and doing the same job as Susie, you wouldn't just copy all of the permissions that they're doing for Sally, right? So you have to make sure that it's appropriate access, that they've got the right access for their projects, and that you're really doing that consistent auditing, right? So I think we talked a little bit earlier, if somebody transitions to a new role, how are we ensuring that that access from the previous role has been removed and now we're applying least privilege to a new role in a different area?
That's really hard, right? A lot of companies do a really good job of onboarding and offboarding, but when an internal candidate transfers from one job to another, they often are asked to kind of keep the other job going. Oh, I'm still doing that job. I still need those permissions. You need to have like a review session, right? Like anytime, especially when IT transfers and they are in critical positions. Okay, well, we're gonna set an appointment on the calendar 30 days from now and review, are you still doing those jobs, right? And then go from there. Like, you don't forget about it. You gotta come back to it. Because, yeah, I understand the business goes on, right? You got to keep the other job going until they fill it or whatever, but that also means you got to come back and review it.
Yeah, for that piece in particular, so when I talk with the team, it's let's develop a solution and a process off of the 95% of the population, and then just determine how you're going to handle exceptions and create a process around that. But don't spend all of your calories trying to solution for an exception. Just be able to handle it, because every exception is going to be a little bit different. And if anybody in here has determined how to not have any exceptions at their firm, please talk to me after this, because I've been trying for many years. But that's one thing just to bring up as you're thinking about internal transfers.
Then I think once you get your hands on that, is actually tying it into segmentation. So go beyond what users and privileges, but what systems should have privileges to talk to other systems. And I know a lot of times that's gotten, a bit of a struggle. Microsoft's had it for years with, one-way trust with cert authorities to their domain controllers. And it's been hard for a lot of organizations to be able to move into that fact. I mean, it's been around. We just have slowly started to adapting it.
Another thing to think about is just less dependence on your corporate network for on-prem applications. If you can move it to a SaaS model or in the cloud, then you can provide granular controls using a cloud identity, which have better controls than on-prem identities. So as an example, Microsoft has a lot of different offices. We moved to a no corporate Wi-Fi a few years ago. So there used to be a CorpNet that had access to the internal network. Now all the Wi-Fi for employees included is just straight out to the internet. So we just access things on the cloud through SharePoint or whatever, using our cloud identity. Now there are times when we still have to VPN, and we'll just use our VPN to get to a specific application, but those applications are less and less. So if you can do that and start moving things to the cloud and have less dependence on on-prem, then you won't have to worry about, I mean, that's a form of segmentation in itself. I have an episode from my podcast that's coming out on Monday, so you guys get a little bit of preview, but we talk about zero trust and help desk security and how a lot of companies, that is oftentimes a very vulnerable segment of your company, because, for example, we talk about passwords. Like, are your help desk employees able to reset passwords? If they are, that's not really zero trust because they have access to identities that are privileged, right? So are you scoping out who they can reset their passwords for? Also, how are you validating users to reset those passwords? Are you providing them with some sort of challenge and response, or do they just call in and put in a ticket? How do you provide that password to them securely? Is it through a ticketing system that's unencrypted or just through email? Do you require them to change their password as soon as you get the temporary password? If you have self-service password reset, that should be a no-brainer in my opinion, because you're not only offloading the tickets, the number of tickets, which is a cost that you guys can go back to your ticketing system and look at how many tickets are coming in for password resets and calculate that, and then offload it to the users themselves. And then if you do have a self-service password reset and a ticket comes in for a password reset help, maybe instead of resetting the password, you could walk the user through that self-service password reset process, right? So that's, as you're thinking about zero trust, there's a lot of areas, not only in just your systems and your identities, but also just your processes in general. Yeah. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that.
No, I'd actually be curious to know if anybody in the audience has, what types of processes you've attempted to try to do as far as verification with your service desk, because if you think about it, at the end of the day, you have to look at what the service desk has access to data-wise for your associates. So have you found success in challenge response? Have you found success in asking challenge questions, or security questions, apologies. Has anybody tried that, and has it worked successfully at their firm? I'm getting a thumbs up from the man in green in the back.
Everyone else is going to go take a hard look at their help desk when we're done here. Do you have a good process at yours? Do you want to share?
We have about 60,000 employees, so if they call in to watch other device, whatever it may be, we don't have an MFA per se. They'll be asked a question about their identity, the help desk will, almost like go to your bank, right? Like, what was your last deposit? Who was your last deposit from? Something like that. And there's really no problem. Actually, people are happy to do it.
Then you're providing that person who's resetting the password to that also sensitive information too, right?
Well, no, if they don't answer the question the correct way, then, okay, we'll put a ticket, we'll see if we can help you, and then kind of go to the wayside. So.
Oh, interesting. So if I'm understanding this correctly, it's almost like they see the question, the person responds to it, they type it in, and that, like, something to that effect. So they actually never get visibility to it.
MFA, basic log on. But let's say you get locked out. Let's say your MFA's not working. Let's see, actually said where user got a new phone, and actually if you get T-Mobile Sprint, actually server messaging is turned off for 2 days, so you won't be able to get those codes. So they have to call in, and the help desk will be like, hey, well, I'm Bobby Joe. All right, Bobby Joe. What's a question about your identity? And if they don't answer it the correct way, they're like, okay, well, we'll open a ticket for you, please call back later. And, we're a large company, so we definitely, try to be hacked that way before. Red TV try to get it that way also. So, it works though.
Okay. Well, thanks for sharing. Yeah, the other thing I think companies struggle with is when we're in a hybrid world. So if you think about how devices have traditionally been managed, most companies are using domain-joined Windows machines, and we're talking Windows here, but could also talk Macs. For example, if you're binding your Macs to AD, that's really a legacy process. Please don't do that. Because your users will hate you for it when they change their passwords and they have keychain issues. If you've worked at a help desk, you know what I'm talking about. I started my career at a help desk. So, but a lot of companies struggle because passwords, those domain-joined machines have to have line of sight to on-prem domain controllers because you're signed in with user identities who are synced on-prem. And so by default, when you set passwords, you have to sync that machine and have line of sight to the domain controller. Right? Does this all make sense? Right? So you struggle because you have to have a VPN connected, and if they can't log in, they can't connect to the VPN, or they can't cache those credentials because they don't remember their previous password because you're rotating your passwords. All these things to think about. I talk to a lot of companies about moving towards more modern management, and this could be a talk track in itself, but there are modern ways that you can use cloud identities to then authenticate to machines, including Macs and whatnot. Like, for example, if you're binding your Macs to Active Directory, which is common in the old days to provide access to printers and be able to log in using your corporate identity, then when you change the password, because Apple uses the password for the encryption, if you're enforcing full disk encryption, that won't sync with the user identity that's going to be signing in, and so your whole thing breaks, and so you have keychain issues. You could use something like Nomad, which is No More AD, which is it's an open source project that was purchased by Jamf. Jamf is a leader in like Mac OS, MDM. They have a product themselves that they use that I've used before, which is great. But you could use Nomad, which is free, just no support, which will then allow you to authenticate using a cloud identity to that machine and sync those credentials. So think about moving towards modern management and getting away from domain joined, because in this day and age, having devices depend on line of sight to an on-prem corporate network is kind of backwards thinking, in my opinion. So some of the things that when you start getting into more advanced is having a SIM and an XDR or a EDR solution and having those alerts come in and then being able to triage them. I think I see a lot of companies struggle because they're not getting very high fidelity alerts or they're not tuning it very well. How would you suggest is a good way to implement a SIM and getting an incident response or a SOC stood up if you don't have one today?
In my wheelhouse now, so here we go. I think you got to start with the basics. So for me, what we did is we implemented a security monitoring team, and then we implemented an IR team. Both different level of skills of what they're able to do. We take a lot of potential new incomers. We put them in security monitoring so they can start learning what the attacks are. So when we implement our SIM, we start with some of the basic rules. It could be something as simple as, someone elevated their privilege to domain admin, something like that. It could also be whatever, security tool you have has fired off on an alert. Once you can start working on it, and again, we go back to asset management and everything you discussed in the beginning. Getting the feel and the baseline of what your organization does is crucial for this matter. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a ton of alerts that you're just going to check all and delete because you've seen them a million times. So starting with the basic, understanding your baseline of what alerts start to trigger, and then tuning your alerts is really one of the things you got to really start with when we put in your SIM. And then depending on your SIM, it really ties into how tough that is. If you're going something like a Splunk, A lot of times you have to bring in a contractor to write the rules, if there's a level, or all the way basics down to, I remember years ago, Alien Vault had a really simple one too. So once you get your SIM stood up and you have people to monitor it, it's a matter of keeping them active so that they are used to what's going on. Once the alert happens, that they're, we put pre-built SLAs. So if a certain alert fires off, they have X amount of time in order to get to that ticket, escalate it up, IR responds to it, and then we close it out. And that's really the basics. And I know I'm going over a ton of other, more granular items into that, but that's really the basics of how we kind of set things up and move forward.
I think that was a phenomenal answer. And I would do everything that Kevin just said.
Oftentimes, when I talk about incident response, when like the big one happens, right? Like we're talking SOC where it's just like little alerts here and there, right? But like when the big one happens, do you have an actual run book? Do you have a plan? Do you have communication, right? So in the Air Force, I was part of the emergency management flight or wing, which was stood up after 9/11. Every state, every city, the University of Wisconsin has an emergency management so that everyone talks the same language, because during 9/11 we had police officers, fire department, FAA all have different types of emergency response. So now everyone talks on the same language, everyone has the same verticals. So do you have a plan with people listed out with their contact information? Do you have legal? Do you have HR? Do you have marketing or communications or whatever? Do you have emails ready to go if you have to communicate with customers that you had an incident? The government just passed legislation or executive order. I can't remember what it is, but that all the critical infrastructure wings have to report a cybersecurity incident within 72 hours. So like, do you have that plan? Do you have that red book we used to call in the Air Force, like to pull off the shelf and look through, ready to go when the big one happens, I call it, right?
Yeah, and I think the other piece of that is, are you practicing it? How often are you practicing it? How often do you look at that plan? Are you keeping it fresh so you can literally grab it off of the table and put it in action? Because you really don't want to wait for an incident in order to enact your incident response plan. So that would be something to make sure you continue to fine-tune it as well.
And I can't think of it right now, but there are websites online that you can produce really, really good playbooks. You go down there and you put in a few variables and it will start producing the basics of what you need to respond to them. Because really getting the basics down, getting your team to understand it, work through it, and going into tabletops. First of all, going through a tabletop just with the key personnel from your team, then expanding that tabletop out to further IT members, and then you get to really have fun when you bring in the red team and don't even tell the blue team that you're doing something to see how they're doing their tabletop. That always kind of spurs a little tension. But you build it out slowly, and again, it's just like anything, right? You have to work through a progression once you implement that plan. And one other thing you can learn from one of the things that's, I probably did in the beginning was wrong, is we had 175 methodologies. So besides the plan, which is the overarching guiding the book to tell you, how you categorize things, how you do this, who's got what roles and responsibilities, we went really into depth that, hey, if this alert is, phishing email, or this is an antivirus, all the way down. And, there were so many methodologies that it was overwhelming to keep up. We really slimmed them down, down to really 50 now, which still seems like a lot, but it's not as granular, to make it simple for when you bring in someone new into your department, that they can grasp them to the point they get used to them. Because really what happens is, after the 20th time that they've walked through one of your methodologies, they know what to do.
I really like what you just said, Kevin, about you put in a whole bunch of different variables and then it kind of gives you a scenario, right? Because your team, if your team just creates the scenario, you're going to create what's comfortable for you, right? What you know how to solve. So even if you can't use something like that, maybe having a moderator come in from a different peer firm that can actually run the tabletop for you and then say, hey, I noticed you did this. Have you thought about this? I mean, getting that outside perspective is extremely valuable, especially with this.
And I think it's Black Hill Security. They created a card game. Breaches, I can't remember what the other, but where you have your different cards with injects. Because everybody runs a tabletop perfectly, right? That's the hard, you sit there and it's a 2-hour tabletop, in a half hour they've solved 3 days worth of stuff. But having something to throw in an inject, I mean, heck, one time we had a bunch of injects written down on paper and we rolled a dice. And whatever that number is, that's the inject we're throwing at them to keep them off their guard and actually make the tabletop function, the way an incident is, because nothing runs perfect. Someone's either not there, all of a sudden one of your tools aren't working. So practicing the beginning how everything can go right and then how everything go wrong. Because that's always the hard part, is how do you practice things that go wrong to be able to overcome it, so you don't look, your team just looks like they're fumbling around when you have directors and C-levels and that, and hopefully never showing up in the newspaper because you didn't practice your plan thoroughly enough and with enough people.
Just one last thing, and then I'll let Andy go to his next topic. But the other piece to consider is communication. How are you communicating with all of these individuals? Is it over the phone? Is it email? Is it discoverable? Is it not? Can you print it out? All of those things should be questions that you're also asking and weighing the pros and cons of your communication as well.
Your IR plan, one thing, because I've helped people with this, make sure you have a paper copy somewhere off network. I got a call once. He said, hey, we had ransomware hit us, and this is a friend of mine. And I said, okay, get out your playbook. Tell me where you're at. Oh, it's on the file server. It's gone. So in ensuring that you have either a paper copy or another copy distributed out to different members of the team is really crucial, because having it is great until you can't access it, and then you're lost.
I love both of those points, because a good friend of mine, I don't know if you guys have read his article, but he was an identity engineer at Maersk during the NotPetya ransomware. So he was ground zero when it happened. He had only been working at the company for about a year. And so I've talked to him extensively. If you read through his blog on it, it's amazing, because he details out all the mistakes that IT made that led up to NotPetya happening to Maersk, even though it was, a Russian-Ukrainian cyber attack. But it attacked the whole world, and so Maersk was obviously one of the ones. And they talked about how there was one Surface 4 that they were able to spin a backup of their domain controller on, and that was how they recovered everything. It was just one Surface that had a domain controller running on it from a backup. So, and part of that was they lost email, they lost all communication, they didn't have access to anybody's numbers. So they had to use, WhatsApp or Signal or some asynchronous communication, which, again, if you're talking about discovery and core, how is that? And now the SEC also came out with another ruling, or another reporting rule, that all publicly traded companies have to report cybersecurity incidents within a certain amount of time. So those are all things to start thinking about. What's your DR plan? Do you have paper copies? And then, are you practicing that, right? Because I know at my previous company, to shut down the company for a day, or even IT or even cybersecurity alone for a whole day exercise, was not something that they were willing to invest in. But you could do part of it. Let's just run through an exercise and look at our backups and restore one server. Can we do that? Is the backup offline? That you don't have to do everything, but you could do one exercise, and maybe out of that exercise you discover, oh, it's taking 3 hours to restore one server. How are we going to do it if we have 300 servers, right? So you get valuable information just by tabletopping or running through one specific exercise. Was there a question over here? No? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Just you on that, you were speaking about the SEC and all that sort of stuff. How long before the United States adopts something like the GDPR or something similar, and how effective do you think that will be, given how distributed the states are in terms of their own legislations?
Well, and maybe Devin or Kevin can speak to this, but I know from experience at other companies, California has a privacy law, and they've recently changed it to make it more stringent. And because a lot of states do business with California, they have to adhere to those particular regulations and compliance. But because of how the United States is, every state has their own regulations, and we don't have a federal one quite yet. But for me, I follow the news pretty steadily, and I see a lot of improvements through the industry. I don't think it's going to be long before we maybe have a federal one, but I mean, the latest administration's executive order or whatever it was for critical infrastructure, the FDIC has reporting instructions now, the SEC, the SEC and the FCC as well, all have rules and policies that are requiring companies to disclose cybersecurity incidents. And so I see a change in the industry in general moving towards stronger. Your question was more around privacy, which is a little bit different.
Well, just in terms of security in general, yeah, I was fortunate to be in the industry when kind of GDPR kind of kicked in Europe as well as a lot of Africa, and we saw a lot of strategy changes just purely because of that. I know for a fact, big companies like Google, Facebook were all heavily punished, a year after that was put in. My experience so far in the US is that there seems to be a lack of guidance from up top in terms of where we're going, what's good, what's not good, how do we do that? And so my question was more like, where do you see that going in the next couple of years? And if it's a US GDPR in the next 3 to 5 years, I feel like that's probably going to change the industry again.
Yeah, like I said, I think as far as cybersecurity goes, we see a lot of things that are happening. Privacy is a totally different thing. Europeans take privacy very differently than Americans do. And also privacy is kind of a different topic, right? It's at my previous company, we had a privacy officer and we had a cybersecurity officer, and they worked hand in hand, but she was compliance focused, privacy focused. She was in the litigation as far as lawyers and everything. So a lot of times they come from the legal side, and so there's an overlap. For sure, I always say a Venn diagram, if you're familiar with what a Venn diagram is. Privacy and cybersecurity overlap, but on the far ends, they're actually very different things.
Well, I mean, that's the same as compliance right now, cloud compliance. The only reason companies are doing massive cloud compliance reports is because of their insurance agencies saying, well, you don't comply to this, so you're going to have to pay more. So that's effectively the market driving the business. Insurance and cybersecurity really have nothing to do with each other, but they actually do today.
I see CISA getting involved a lot more, especially in the last year. I wouldn't doubt that you may see CISA step up and CISA and NIST drive in together and start making this. I'll say from an IR perspective, right, understanding where you do business and where your data can be lost is like I said, it can be confusing at times because depending where the breach happens, what state you're doing business, I remember at one time, I think there was an IR tool that actually literally you could put in the state you did it, and it would give you the forms that you need to be compliant due to privacy. It's been a very confusing aspect in that. If you're lucky enough to have a compliance officer, right, they're the over-guiding one for you. But I think if we look for anyone, I would look at CISA to drive that.
I was just going to say, I'm not sure, and this is my Devon perspective, I'm not sure that we'll have something that's globally applied over the United States. And the reason I am saying that is because I'm seeing different states defining what privacy means, what types of data that applies to, and not only the data, but how it's combined, right? So if you have a full name and a birth date in some states, that may be considered a privacy breach, maybe not. So those are the pieces that I think, to get everybody's agreement on that, it may be a while until we get there.
I know. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, it actually dovetails into the question I was going to ask is, so you do have in Colorado, Virginia just came out with their own rules, and yet it's a little more privacy, so maybe open to the whole room. How do you stay ahead of all these, okay, say you just operate domestically, you don't have to worry about GDPR, you're not in Canada, but you're in the States. How do you stay ahead and let people know what you need to do in the different places? Is there tooling you turn to? Do you turn to a partner, business partner? What's a good strategy in that area to just address it?
Sure, and I'm going to talk just a little bit high level on this, but I would say find a reputable source. So whether that is an auditor or something that you work, some person that you work with, that would be great. You know, have continuous touch points with them. I know that our information security team interfaces with our legal team, so we got really lucky there because they kind of have to stay updated on that. But if you find your reputable source, and that could either be the internet, or like I said, an actual individual that can keep you updated on those new regulations.
Yeah, and like I said, a lot of companies are spinning up their own compliance officer, privacy officer, or department where their whole job is to stay up with those type of regulations, right? And if you can't find that, partnering with legal. I think in general, cybersecurity should partner with legal. That should be a strategic partner at every company, that and finance, because as contracts come in for different applications, they should be approved by information security. We made it a policy at one of my companies that every single piece of software, hardware that is purchased has to be a contract. It has to be reviewed by legal. It has to be, approved by finance, and then it has to be signed off by information security to make sure that it meets our policies. So I think just in general, finance and legal should be a strategic partner for every single information security shop.
So Andy, you said strategic partnership, and I'm going to take us on a completely different road just for a second. So pull me back if you need me to. But what I was thinking about when you said that is you also need to have a strategic partnership with your facilities. So we've talked a lot about, securing our servers and actually ensuring who's got access to that, but who has access to the floor that the servers are on? Are you reviewing that access? Are you looking at that at all? And how often is somebody able to go in there? Do you allow them to go 24/7 because they have to do patch updates or anything like that? That's just one other thing that we haven't touched on physical security, and I just wanted to bring that up because it is kind of that backdrop that if you're not looking at it, it could cause you a lot of problems.
Yeah, a lot of smaller companies, information security is the physical security because a lot of controls are now digital, right? So I implemented it, physical security, at one of my previous companies. Fortunately, at another company, we had a whole physical security department, which was great because they handled all the access controls and cameras and all of that. But then they had to partner with us for segmentation of the network to make sure that they would have access to it. They would ask us to have access off-prem for their cameras, and we said no, and they were mad about that. But so that's those are things to think about. So yeah, the physical security is a tenet of information security, and if you have physical, one of my favorite movies, I'm a huge Star Wars fan. If you haven't seen it, it's Rogue One, which is a great information security movie because they break into a facility, right, to steal the plans of the Death Star, which is proprietary information, but they got physical access and then beamed it out on the networks, right? So if you can't protect your physical locations, then you don't have information security.
I kind of feel like we should be queuing up just that little segment up on these, just so you guys can actually get a full feel, maybe have some surround sound there. That'd be great. Next time, we can pin that one.
So I know a lot of companies, as we're talking through all of these things, so we're at like the basic and the kind of the medium part of your security journey. We haven't even gotten to like the advanced part, and you're probably thinking to yourself, holy cow, this is a lot. Or maybe you're thinking we're good, and you're going to wait for Kevin to talk about all the advanced things that he's doing. But if you don't have the expertise or the capability, there are ways to outsource them. Just like you outsource SaaS applications, you're offloading the threat to a cloud provider for that application to host it and make sure it's updated. You could outsource like your SOC, right? Or do that, or outsource implementing certain capabilities if you don't have the expertise to do that. What do you have any advice for companies who might lack the expertise on site to do something like that?
In my past, I started with a $25 million insurance company, local to the state of Ohio. I was the security person. I was the network person who became the security person. I was also the physical security person, so I had my open source SIM here and my TV cameras here. But you can scale everything down and again, outsource to other companies to help you. But again, it comes down to what's your priority, what are you concerned about? if you get the basic tenants locked down and you know what's on your network, you know how to respond in those aspects, you can then start to look at where can I put my other dollars through. So if you want to have someone come in and run a tabletop for you, there's a lot of firms nowadays that are very affordable to do that. You can even what I suggest is even hire a pen test company to come in. Start with your external. And once you're done with the external and you get brave enough, let them plug into the internal and go from there. All the while you're doing this, you're building your case for maybe potentially adding another person. Or, I'd say my best solution back then was interns. I was near a digital forensics school, so I had 7 interns. And this is back in the early 2000s, so we didn't have to pay interns back then. So I had basically a little mini free SOC running. And they were eager enough to learn and have the opportunity to gain the experience in there. I would just say my budget was around $50,000 a year. A lot of things were open source, though. I mean, depending on where what you can spend and where you prioritize your spend to, you can really scale things down to a one-man shop or above once you get to the larger companies.
Open source, though, can also be dangerous, right? With Log4j vulnerability being out there, not everyone's depending on that one guy in Kansas City. I'm sure you guys have seen the cartoon of like your entire infrastructure is all these blocks, and then there's this one little tiny leg, which is this guy who's underpaid in Kansas City who's been maintaining the software since 1990 on his own. That's Log4j, right? It was like 2 volunteers who were like patching all of this.
But we weren't spoiled in our days. We had to compile our own stuff and sit there and wait for the compile to run. So you knew what was in your code. Nowadays it's, executables that are built that are open source. Again, you got to vet what you do, vet the source you come from, and really put a little behavior analysis to it. You can put a free IDS there to sniff the traffic to understand what's going on. And really, that's one of the basic layers you can put too is a free IDS, like Snort or something in there, and understand the baseline of your traffic. Anything happens laterally, you're going to catch it, and it doesn't really take, let's put it this way, it could take a lot of resource, a little resource. It just depends on how much effort you want to put into it to understand it.
I know a lot of information security shops have trouble hiring application security folks. That's really specialized position, and there's not a whole lot of people out there. That was one of the things that we outsourced at my previous company was we had internal developers, but we needed an AppSec program. We needed AppSec as part of our overall structure, and so we outsourced it to like a program like BugCrowd. But we also had continuous scanning with our developers with like something like Veracode. So they can hook into their IDE and then scan their code, and you can review it. So you at least have a framework of a program, and then you're outsourcing the actual scanning of the code, or hire like a pen tester who knows application pen testing and review those things. But I know that for a lot of companies, AppSec is one of the things that are coming up. If you're developing your own applications, and you don't have an AppSec program, you should at least have a framework for one as a basic one.
Yeah, that software development lifecycle there is key in there. When the developer gets his first set of code typed, he's ready to go into testing, scan it. Then he can go back and fix it. Then gets to the next. So that way you don't have maybe vulnerabilities that were done in the beginning that are now buried deeper and deeper in the code. And then as you progress and you get to the final, they're ready to go to prod, you have a better chance of getting that last, scan done. Because I can tell you the one thing I always hear people complain about is they're ready to go to prod, they're getting their second, maybe their first scan, and I now have to hold them back while they sit there and have to correct, matters in that aspect.
Yeah, on our podcast, we had Tanya Jenko, who owns a company called We Hack Purple, I think it's called. But she's a former Microsoftie. She started her own company. She's an AppSec person. She has a book called Bob and Alice Learn Application Security, which is actually a great book for anyone who wants to learn about how to run an AppSec program. It's written at a very friendly level, not too technical. But she talks about how, as an analogy, it's a lot easier to design and build a house and design and say, oh, in the design phase, I'm going to put a bathroom in the ground floor. But then when you start to build the house and you have the foundation and everything's framed in, now you say, I want to put in a bathroom. It's a lot harder to put it in afterwards, right? So shifting left, it's called, like on the software development lifecycle, and making sure that you're building in security from the start and not waiting till you're ready to push to prod and then doing your first scan, but yeah, scanning along the way, right? So,
And if you can encourage them to go to secure coding classes, that really helps in the beginning.
yeah, because all developers just want to make it work. They don't care if it works securely or not. So when you start to get a little bit more advanced, you start to talk about internal threat hunting, because a lot of internal IT and information security shops are so worried about deploying tools and looking at alerts that are coming in and triaging those. But then when you get really advanced and you start to relax a little bit, you've already tuned the alerts, you're able to triage those. Now you start to threat hunt and maybe have your own red team. Maybe you outsource it at first for an external pen test, but then ideally, think if you have the budget and you have the know-how, like at Kevin, you have your own internal red team. So talk about, I'd just like to hear a little bit about how you've developed a red team at your company and how that works.
Yeah. And I'll say both those teams, the hunt team and the red team, are the two biggest teams that always scare me when they are all happy to come to me and say, we found something. You always see the red team always doing, they all have their little dance or whatever they do. And I've been a blue teamer, most of my career, so there's always that kind of grudge against them, but we'll keep that there. So slowly we developed, we started with the vulnerability management. So being able to get the basic vulnerabilities down, understand what they are, and even if you're developing a person, red team are really very accepted in the market. A lot of them are consultants, but once you can start building an acumen, understand what vulnerabilities do, how you can exploit them, then you can start working into slowly red teaming your website. One thing that we do, we call ad hocs. So once our red teams are rolling, we let them pick an area of the network that they've got internal knowledge, so they know all understand what areas maybe software developers will allow them to start testing that and hopefully stay there if it's possible.
Hey, Kevin, could you grab another microphone? Yours died, I think.
Sorry about that. So we slowly start to roll them into, again, testing simpler areas to begin with. So based on, I'm not sure how much you heard, but based on vulnerability scans, you can really tell which areas are softer than others that really need more attention. And then, in one aspect, we call it validation of the scan, right? So really a validation of the scan is they notice you have a potential opportunity for an exploit here. They then either write the exploit or they have a tool, CrowdStrike, Metasploit, whatever it is, and they can then exploit that part. Then they can come back and actually show proof. And again, here we are raising the priority that, hey, not only do you have a vulnerability, we've proven it. From there, and with our red team, we call those ad hoc, so they can have that ability. We go into more structured red teams where we do, again, our website, our network. If we bring in a new product, and I will say we brought in some EDR product at one time, and we were rather shocked that we found out that we could hide second stage payload down, and it never saw it. So we really go into testing our whatever products we bring in when we feel that control needs to be validated, and we do a lot of control so. And I know I'm rambling a bit here, but we do a lot of control validation with them too. So if you have, antivirus on the desktop, you have an EDR system, and IDS, having them test that tool based on something that should happen is another great way to implement your red team and have them do it. And your red team really can be anybody that you start to train and help them do that, and they understand how the tools work. From there, as you get more advanced with that red team, that's when we start playing games, red team versus blue team. Sometimes we tell the blue team, other times we don't, and we work from there. The third part is that red team also helps tie with, again, potential future spend that you may need due to areas that they find, and they can turn around and take that and show how, if you improve this aspect, how much resource it may save, because you don't no longer need somebody there to help manage it as much, or worry about that vulnerability in that regards.
Yeah, I like how you talked about testing applications that you bring in. If you're not advanced in that manner, a lot of companies, and I hate this because I'm a vendor, but they'll have a vendor security questionnaire to fill out, right? And so I did this at my previous company, and it's a great way to at least get an idea of the software and the vendor that you're trying to purchase from, what their security posture is and how they manage the data and how they respond to things. And I know that we brought in one time a new application that was being developed, and was like a survey app or something like that one of our particular commercial arms wanted to use. And we gave them our standard questionnaire, and we just have a score. Like most vendors out of 100 would score in the 60s and 70s just based on things, and they'd have little line items to say why they didn't do something or whatever. But this vendor specifically scored in like the 30s, and it was the lowest we'd ever seen a company. They were a startup, and they didn't really have, they were using a dev environment for their Okta portal, and they didn't have MFA turned on and all this other stuff. And we recommended to the organization to not purchase that application or not get a contract for it, and they decided to anyways. And so our CISO made sure that VP of that organization signed a specific form to say, we accept this risk, and we've recommended as an information security organization that this is a high risk to the company, and you're accepting the risk, not us. We've recommended the right way. So even if you don't have an internal red team to do specific pen testing of applications you bring in, you can still have some sort of basic security questionnaire to get an understanding. And there's actually products out there. We use a third-party product to generate these little surveys.
Yeah, and back to the base, like you said, the basic piece. If you're just testing the controls of your security tools, that's still a red team engagement. That's still building it. So have them walk the firewall. They find an open port. Why don't they just try to play with Telnet, see what they get back from it? Make sure your IPS is actually blocking. Know a few rules that come to there. Test your SIM to see if it's firing off the proper rules. So there's really some basic control validations that should be going on anyways, but you can tie that really into a basic part.
And I think, if you don't have a red team, blue team that's focusing on that technology aspect of it or external impact, you can also do something like an insider threat program. So where you look at, again, we're talking about privileged users, what they have access to, things of that nature, but determining, what the narrative is behind somebody accessing a certain system. So if, for example, person A is a data analyst and they are logging on the weekend and they're doing an upgrade, for example, if you only know that they're logging on the weekend and you don't know the fact that they're doing an upgrade, you might think that that's a little odd if it's outside of what their typical realm and narrative is as an associate. So there are two aspects of this, I think, or three actually, because you have the technology, external, and then also looking at your internal associates as well.
Yeah, and sometimes you can look at not only access, but where your data is flowing. So like, say a cloud, a CASB, a cloud access security broker, you could look at, for example, if your organization uses Dropbox and they don't use Box, and then all of a sudden you see an employee upload 4 terabytes of data to Box, and you should be like, well, what's going on there? Like, why are you uploading that data? So, that's another way of analyzing access and where the data is flowing. Kevin, you have a threat intelligence program at your organization too, which I think is also fairly advanced. I think all of us kind of do a little bit of threat intelligence, but that's another tenet of cybersecurity that is very important. As a former military member, I see a lot of military intelligence officers and people in that field go into threat intelligence, and it's very unique. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about how that works at your company.
Yeah, and I'll say threat intelligence has grown quite a bit. I'd say 5 years ago, we had one guy with an open source tool that was feeding, threat feeds into it, and then he had to, after a certain time, remove them himself. It was really, really resource intensive what they did. There are so many opportunities right now for threat intelligence coming from multitudes of sources. Of course, you have, again, CISA sends us out a lot. There's other government organizations that will send you information. And now we can almost talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of threat intelligence, because everything they throw at you that's an indicator tends to be a part of threat intelligence. But you really have to have, like we have someone that vets out a lot of threat intelligence into us. Now, our threat intelligence has matured to a simple person that was just bringing in threat indicators and then feeding them into our SIM. So now our SIM can use that for an automated method to detect on something that may be a more recent event that's occurring, or someone else seeing that you're part of their, secret organization. And I say that because there's a lot of threat intelligence organizations where you're vetted, you become part of them, and then they start feeding you information. On top of the FSI, we have FSI SACs or the other ISACs in that regards. With the way I think security's gotten nowadays, there is a lot of information being fed from a threat, both from Twitter, any other social media platforms, and I will say honestly, back in the day, attackers like to brag what they're doing, and having someone monitor Twitter, you'd almost have their indicators, right after they did it, because they were bragging, I took this site down, or I did this. So threat intelligence slowly has been a slow progression from doing that to having someone actively tied into a multitude of threat groups, working with them. And I'll say we have ran more threat virtual response teams than anything in the last year. So as our threat team has moved forth past, looking at indicators, calling them out to the vuln management team or something, hey, there's a new CVE out. They've actually gotten to the point that if we know company X has been breached, the threat intelligence group starts to discuss it, come back with us what that attack may have looked like, and we bring a team together with security architecture and we evaluate our controls against with that. One of our missions daily for our operations team is to be proactive, and that's one of the ways that we be proactive, by getting ahead of things, by seeing how things are going up. The other part is, when there's an incident occurring or something going on, we can reach out to the threat team or the threat team in their organizations and say, has anybody else seen this? Especially, in the financial sectors with some of the groups, they can go back, yep, we're seeing the same cred stuffing attack coming, and we're seeing the same indicators of you, and here's how we're doing to stop it. It really has grown to a more, when we talk about threat sharing, is really sharing, and also how to stop some of the attacks coming at you, or how to set other factors to detect it too. I have one individual, that's his full-time job, and that's kind of how we tied it. We put out a daily brief every day that goes to different areas of the bank and different executives with the latest, here's the hot stories that happened in the last, here's what we saw, here's the actions we took when we reviewed it, here's some open status items, and here's some other things that we're tracking too. Because the interesting part is, once you get rolling like that, or getting a newsletter produced like, your threat intelligence people will be 3 weeks at least ahead of the media. So once it comes up on TV and this breach happened, and now you have your execs saying, what do you know about this? They already have all the information to feed to them.
In addition to that, all right, thanks, yeah. So in addition to that, I think having a really good vendor management program as well, and doing due diligence so that when a breach does happen, you know what type of data is being held, who the contact people are, and all of those critical pieces that'll make your job just a little bit easier if that does happen.
Yeah, having a good procurement process and vendor relationship. If you don't have someone dedicated, I think all of us do a little bit of threat intelligence all the time. As part of our job, it's more defensive, really, like as a story comes out. Being more advanced and being able to be ahead of like the news that's coming through is great. But really having even a person who is tracking Twitter or tracking the news, like for example, at my previous org, there was a healthcare company, and during COVID, a lot of cyber attacks were happening to healthcare companies and hospitals, and so executives were asking about that, and so we needed to provide a response as well. So having those, and or even friends in the industry, but having that being someone's full-time job is really great. So think about having a dedicated threat intelligence person. Like when SolarWinds happened, right? I was fortunate enough that I had a friend. I wasn't at Microsoft at the time, but I had a former colleague at Microsoft who messaged me at 6 a.m. in the morning. He sent me a tweet from one of the journalists, and they're like, you should look into this. And fortunately, I did, and we had SolarWinds at our company, and so it was a mad scramble to get it patched. But nobody else knew about it at my company because nobody else was reading nobody had time to look at Twitter or look at the news. But because I was tracking it, even though it wasn't my full-time job, we were able to get ahead of it and get patched that particular day. So those are things that we're talking about here when we talk about threat intelligence, is having someone who is up on when things are happening and being able to respond as a company to those things.
Yeah, and some of your tools already have it built in. The Microsoft team, they have their own threat intelligence team, same as Cisco, Zscaler, all those, they have their own threat intelligence that's feeding into it. I think the important part when you scale that, say you don't have a resource, but you're dependent on the vendor, is understand what they're feeding you. Because there's a confidence level of what threat should be coming into you. And if you're not totally aware, and then you're trying to identify, hey, why was this IP blocked? Sometimes it's in there. I've seen, from external sources start feeding us IPs that were I think one was the city of New York. So you got to really vet with confidence what ones and how it works in your organization. You can scale, again, you can scale this back. You can put a lot of automations. There's threat intelligence platforms out there that tie into your SIMs and all your tools. So there are opportunities to still do it and set yourself up RSS feeds, items like that, to really simplify your work for it, but yet you're still getting the data you need to act on.
Devin, you had mentioned data classification in the beginning when I talked about knowing where your data is and knowing what it is, but I think data classification is more of an advanced exercise. So identifying where your data is and what is sensitive is a basic exercise, and then data classification is another. Can you talk about a little bit more in depth on how to classify data?
Sure. So the first step of that is really looking at the data you hold, right? So that I think that's what we kind of touched on a little bit earlier, and what you define as critical data. So what would be either cause a reputation issue or would cause you to be fined and lose money, right? So look at the particular areas where you have that critical data. So we'll go with PII, for example. And then start to dig into what servers hold PII, what applications hold PII, and start to pull back the layers. There are many layers of this onion. You're not going to get it right the first time. So if you start with determining, let's just say you've got a business unit that for example, RFAs deal with social security numbers and account numbers, right? So they've got access to that. So you would look at the types of servers that information's on, look at the databases, look at which databases hold on to that, where those databases are potentially replicated. So you're going all the way down to a very granular level and then determining who has access to those individual things. That's just one slice. So I won't completely bore you, because you can really apply that same process to any other piece of data, but you look at your most critical data, look at where it's held, look at who has access to it, and you continue to go through that cyclical rotation until you have all of your data that's critical classified.
Okay, so I'm going to put you guys a little bit on the spot, and we're going to talk about something that's very near and dear to my heart, because everything that we've talked about today has to deal with systems and data and policies and all of that. But at the center of all of that is people. And I do a lot of cybersecurity mentoring for people who are trying to get into the industry. And one of the complaints is that there are no entry-level positions for cybersecurity. Do you think, in your opinion, that there is an entry-level, true entry-level position for cybersecurity folks to get into?
Absolutely. I get my interns poached all the time from me, so. And they're still interns. I can say way back in the early 2000s when I started an intern program, they're getting scooped up. I would say nowadays, if they at least get their foot in the door somewhere, and maybe that's just getting your college degree or getting an intern to start some of the, the more low-level jobs. There's so many jobs out there. I think, what was the last statistic? You could fill an NFL football stadium, that the opportunity is there. The other half is, I'll say too, is if you're an organization and you want to move in it, just start showing the interest in doing the extra work. I can't tell you how many people I interview that want to make a lateral move into information security, but they're not doing the work to get there. So a lot of times, I may mentor the person that talks to me and say, okay, here's all the online, areas, and you can learn a little bit more about it. Come talk to me after a while. And they just kind of don't do it. I think in those regards, if you're not putting the effort out there, you're not going to find it. But there are lots of entry-level opportunities out there. You just got to make that step and that initiative to move forth, learn a little bit, and they're there.
And I would also say it's about marketing your company, right? So are you going to colleges? Are you actually doing recruiting fairs? Are you talking about what you do in cybersecurity, what potential there is for an entry-level position, right? So you said interns. Interns are great. Just make sure you're giving them really hardcore work and they're not just moving papers around or doing data entry. Because that's where you're gonna start to create the excitement for your company so that they go and tell their friends, hey, you really need to work for X, Y, and Z company because I had a really fruitful experience here and now I'm in this position as an information security analyst, for example. So you really start to build that talent when you go to the schools and start to talk to colleges, even high schools if they're local, right? We do some high school interns as well. So start them young, get them in, get them learning, and then you can always find folks, like you were saying, Kevin, if they're not in information security already, what are your transferable skills that you're actually looking for? So are you really looking for somebody that can come in and do your data analysis right off the bat? Is that part of the job description? If yes, they could be doing that in any other role that they're currently in right now. So instead of saying, do you check all the boxes for this job description? Do you check all the boxes for the transferable skills that we're looking for? So those are the things I would say, kind of start them young, get them in as early as possible, give them some really, really hardcore, fruitful work, and see where that gets you.
As someone that transitioned into cybersecurity, I'm very partial to having an internal mentoring program because you will not find a more talented pool of individuals than the folks who work at your help desk. The help desk folks know more about your company, they know more about your applications that are deployed, the people who are coming there than anyone else in your company. And so if you don't have some sort of internal funnel of talent, you should definitely look into that. If you're having trouble finding talent for your cybersecurity shop, you should look at internal and mentoring programs. We started a program at my previous org to allow folks to do like a temporary assignment to an org if they wanted to try business analyst or if they wanted to try program management or whatever. If they wanted to try IT, they could come and spend like 40% of their time doing that and report to a temporary manager, and then 60% still doing their regular job. And so try to develop people internally because that's how you retain folks. I think there's a lot of companies that are struggling to retain people, and if you're willing to invest in them and educate them, then they're going to be willing to work for you and stay.
One point we didn't touch on is what if you have only advanced individuals in your org and you really want to create that entry level? How do you convince your leadership to do that, right? And so bringing in an intern is actually a very low risk, low cost route to go because you could have them for the summer. They're there for 3 months. If they're doing really impactful assignments, you can then start to build a case. If you don't think you have enough work for an entire summer, look maybe in IT and partner with them. So if you're working really closely with your security team and information security, maybe split that time so that you're actually getting the ability to show that you've got project work that individual can work on.
Yeah, and in general, it doesn't matter what tool you have, your people are your greatest assets. I mean, so if you start funneling into them at the beginning, let them realize that you're there to help equip them, give them a roadmap, serve them, what they need to move forward, and let them understand that they're the asset that you're feeding into. To me, time is worth more than money. And you're giving them that time to grow and learn from you and mentor you. That ties in a lot of how that person's eventually going to, develop. And, at some point you start looking at the legacy of where you leave behind and how many people you've touched and impacted. That comes into the assets, because you maybe after a while that person leaves your organization, but they went somewhere else to strengthen security elsewhere too. But that's kind of, the part of growing people and getting to a point where, they're ready to take the next step, either up in your organization or whatever they land.
I just think there's a lot of ways people learn these days, and you're going to find talent in the most different places that you haven't even thought about. And if you're still requiring certain certifications or certain degrees on your job descriptions, and then, for an analyst position, you require 5 years of experience, I mean, that's going to drive away talent from your organization. Our attackers are diverse. They don't require a CISSP to break into your company, right? And they're not, of all different colors and races and experiences. And so diversifying your workforce is a good way to get different perspectives, because if you're all thinking the same and you all come from the same pedigree, then you're going to defend the same and you're going to have vulnerability somewhere else. So, yeah, go ahead.
Kind of an off-topic question, but it is related to cybersecurity. Obviously, the Russian-Ukraine topic is kind of affecting everyone that has a security team. I'm curious, from all three of you, have you seen any short-term impacts, but then also, what do you envision, or I guess, think the long-term impacts of the invasion will mean for cybersecurity, for security in general?
So the way I look at it, we've always been preparing, trying proactive, and defend against nation states. Russia's always been on that list, amongst we can name the other countries. What we see more is resource time being spent just getting more intel back to us at this point, right? You'll see the simple tactics that and I don't mean simple tactics, but what their basic tactics are, that, a lot of them are tied back to some of their ransomware teams, what they're doing, the ones that they arrested and maybe not working for them at this point to do, some more of their attacks. But to look at what, and I would go beyond the media, really. Look what other organizations are saying they're seeing. Now, some organizations are seeing a little raise in scanning happening. Again, they're looking for low-hanging fruit that they can go after and make a statement for. Back to the groups, the more infamous hacking groups that just wanted to make a statement. That's kind of what they're doing. So again, nation states have been doing this. We've been part of a cyber warfare, in my mind, for years. I think this just brings more of the social media aspect up to light. But again, you're putting more resource to be able to prep for it, because if something does happen, right, you got to make sure that you put the attention to it too. Does that help at all? Okay.
Yeah, I think there's two parts from my perspective. One of them is specific to our team, right? So we are getting a lot of questions from our clients. What are you doing? What's going on? Is there something, are you going to keep my data protected? Right? That's really what they care about. And so we've got talking points around that. We are partnering with our client-facing associates to make sure they feel comfortable still doing business with us. So that's one part of the client aspect. The other part is, keep doing your tabletops. Keep doing the things that you were doing, but now just apply it to something that may be a little bit more intense. Because at the end of the day, your incident response plan should still work for anything that occurs.
Yeah, and so we had talking points around this for Microsoft too, and it's just basically do the basics, right? So all the things that we've talked about today, you want to continue to do that, but then monitor like more network traffic, and also evaluate your risk, right? So your risk profile for your company differs on whether or not you have, I talked to a customer that had an office in Ukraine. They had Ukrainian employees. So their risk profile is obviously very different. Or I know some people who have Russian contractors, and their risk profile is very different. They're not necessarily doing business with the government but they are paying Russian nationalists right now with the sanctions in place. Are you a part of critical infrastructure? If you are, then you're probably a higher target. So you have to evaluate your risk profile. If you're, you know, I don't know what business today would not be. I talked to a semiconductor customer the other day, and they're obviously very jazzed up about, you know, the whole conflict, and so they're a high value target. So it all comes down to your risk profile, and then of course doing the basics. And then I would say if you have an IR team or you have a threat hunting team, threat intelligence is going to be even more important now with the conflict. But if you have those teams that are analyzing where your traffic is coming from, where it's going to, do you have any externally available applications? Are you doing pen testing? Those sorts of things. Those are all part of what we're talking about. But I wouldn't panic. And I would also just evaluate your risk profile as a company to see if you are a high value target, right?
Because the first question you get is, are you blocking Russian IP space, right? And you know, we kind of know that if they're any good, they're not going to come through Russian IP space. They're going to proxy from Madison or some other place and pop up under the radar. So understanding the risk profile, getting the basics down, knowing how to respond really ties more into, and it helps you globally to any incident or any new geopolitical or anything else that, you know, the next solar winds that pops up.
Yeah, patching. Make sure you're patching, because there are still organizations that are getting popped with the Exchange proxy vulnerability that was patched, what, a year ago now? If you're still using SolarWinds and you haven't patched, I mean, Log4j, I mean, there's tons of vulnerabilities that require patching. Attackers don't do anything crazy, right? I talked to one customer who was worried about someone sniffing the BitLocker key from the TPM on a physical machine if an attacker were to get physical access to it, which is possible. It's how TPM is designed. If you can tap into the bus, you can sniff the BitLocker key and reconstruct it and then decrypt a machine. They're not going to do that unless you're the president of the United States. They're going to send you a phishing email and you're going to give them the credentials to your account. That's how it happens, right? So nobody is doing the crazy things. They're just finding the lowest hanging fruit. If you have RDP open with default administrator credentials, which is how SolarWinds got popped, they're going to do that, right? So look at all the basic things you're doing before you start getting into all the crazy 0 days that are happening. We have about 3 minutes left, and I'll open up to any other questions that you guys might have. Go ahead.
What's something for either of you that you've done in the last, say, like year that particularly brought value that you're excited about for your security program?
Do you want me to selfishly give mine? Because it's our identity and access management program. So that's huge. We didn't really have something that was centralized in the last 3.5 years. And so we've now brought it up to a point where we've got standards around it. We've got guiding principles. We know at least where our privileged accounts are and how we're managing those, the teams to talk to, and having that particular program and standard in place is really far from where we were originally. And I think that is, as the years move on, we're going to see that starts to become the basis of cybersecurity. As you heard today, I mean, it's the backbone of a lot of what's focused on here.
Yeah, and we moved a little more towards zero trust, hopefully finally getting to, micro-segmentation, that aspect. But the other half for me too is, in the last year, is really hammering down dealing with the remote workers. Understanding, working through DLP issues, everything, in that regard. And on top of it, and a lot of my stuff is leadership too, is working with your team without being in the room with your team. We have a really nice SOC. Maybe there's 2 people in there at a time right now, just because, people are still scattered. But getting them to understand what their stresses are, how to work with them, and how to make their job, again, more efficient is really, because if my incident responders or pen test team is working more efficient and they're going to do a lot more work for, and a lot more better impact for the company.
Do you want me to say mine? Yeah, I would say identity is probably at most companies, at my previous company, that's what I started with, was segmenting out our privileged accounts. So previously our help desk had local admin, and they were just using their regular credentials to log into user computers and all of that. And so having separate admin credentials and regular credentials, looking at what permissions they have in Active Directory and scoping it appropriately. If you have domain admin users, one of the things that I did was you don't need domain admin all the time. You just don't. You only need domain admin if you're scoping group policy, or if you haven't delegated it out to another role, or you're logging into a domain controller. Otherwise, you just need an administrative account. So what we did was we had a domain admin account that was just domain admin, and then it wasn't able to log on locally to anything else. And then we had an administrative credential, call it a server admin, which was just server administration, had no local admin, because we were server admins as far as information security goes. I didn't need local admin on anybody's machine, right? Maybe my own, but just server administration, and then the help desk would just have local admin using their administrative accounts. So scoping out those privileges, like what Devin is talking about, looking at the very basics of how are you managing your privileged users and what permissions they have access to, separating out cloud as well. A lot of people over permission things. They need all the things. Having a just-in-time system to elevate to something is huge, and there's systems out there that can do that, but everyone's always like, oh, I need permission to this, oh, I need permission to this. Like, how often do you actually use those permissions? You should do an exercise to look at that, and then just give them the permissions that they need on a daily basis. And if they only use the one thing, like for example, compliance manager within the M365 suite, when you're pulling email and e-discovery for things, that's not something that we did on a daily basis, but we had the permissions to do that. We had to escalate to that every single time, so it was tracked, and we had to put in a request from legal before we did that, because we didn't want anyone saying, oh, you accessed our emails without saying something, right? So we had a request come in specifically for legal for an e-discovery case. We would escalate to compliance manager to pull the emails, and then we de-escalate after that. Well, that's our time.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you for coming out.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. Few notes for everybody. Next month, we have David Stoffacker coming from Direct Supply, talking about new cloud innovations and what that is doing to their business. Save the date for our tech conference coming up May 19th. So put that on your calendar. It's a great event. Memberships, Katie? Why don't you tell them?
No, I want to use the mic. We're going to be having Diane Schwartz, the CIO from Johnson Controls, presenting on driving a digital career. We're going to be having it at the brand new garage at the Harley-Davidson Museum. Happens to be on bike night, so if anybody's got a Harley, feel free to drive it on and learn about driving a digital career. Did I hear that? Is that Eric Prince's birthday? Oh! It's a birthday party. It's actually a giant party for Eric. No, but in all seriousness, we're building out some great content for the tech conference. Outside of having Diane from Johnson Controls come talk to us as a keynote, we have a leadership panel we're developing out that's going to be moderated by Generac's own Tim. Yep. So really looking forward to seeing you all there. On the membership note, I know we have a few new faces today. At some point, would love to talk to you a little bit more about what it means to be involved as a member of the WTA. So not just our tech conference or the green beers that are coming after this, but amazing content, guest speakers, and really building out the Wisconsin tech community. So would love to talk to anybody interested. Definitely different options for membership, so definitely find me if you're interested, and we'll talk through it.
You stole my thunder. Yeah. So, yes, next door, if you go out these doors, around the corner in the next set of doors, we got another room. We invite you guys all to come over. It's our meeting after the meeting. Green beer, we got Chef put out some awesome Irish fare. So thank you all for coming and hope to catch up with you next door.